My parents planned a trip for my cousins and I back when we were young. But it wasn't one of those cool trips to Disneyland or camping. It was going to see our extended family. Moms, aunts, and uncles, all of them old and all of them rude. They had never met me, and they already started calling me gorda, which literally means the feminine version of fat in Spanish. It's like an assumed right that you get in my mom's family when you're old. I was not looking forward to the trip, but something happened there that I could never forget, even though it has been almost 20 years since the visit. The small town that we visited still had dirt roads and houses painted in fading bright colors, poorly painted over so much that you could see their previous colors as the pink faded to reveal a blue, which had traces of yellow underneath. But as we walked farther down the street and toward the muddy river, where the trees were, we'd reached the house that belonged to my grandma's sister. The house was now empty, and that's where we would be staying. It was a humble concrete brick house with large unkept fields. My mom used to tell me stories of the beans and the many vegetables that used to grow there to eat and sell. Even though for most, it would have been tough to imagine anything growing in the hard dirt of that field, I could see it. I'd close my eyes and imagine the green plants. I'd imagine my mom running around with her brothers and sisters laughing, just like in the stories she told me many times. The time they outran a snake, the time they found a bicycle and rode it through the fields until the wheels fell off. Even if she was lying, I'd eat those stories right up. I grew up in a crowded city where all I could do was play ball on the street and had to yell pause as loud as possible whenever we saw a car coming. It really messed up our games. Those fields, as dried up as they were so full of stories and those memories my mom would share with me. The sky was orange from the edges on the right, blue and darker purple to the left. Stars had already started to show up above the field, and I got to see as a street lamp, way across the dirt, flickered on from blue to pink to orange and stayed that way. I was too far away to hear it, but I could tell that it buzzed louder than the ones by my house. My cousins and I were already settled in, figuring out where we'd be sleeping and everything. I had to share one of the beds with two of them, and the rest had already placed their blankets all over the living room and couches. Cushions all over the place. Standard cousin sleepover. If it hadn't been for the mosquitoes making so much noise and threatening to get into my ears, I would have stayed outside longer. The things still managed to get inside, but there at least we could see them resting against the pistachio-colored walls, where they just stayed there like glued-on statues, waiting for something. I got up very early with that sour taste in my mouth. I had forgotten to brush my teeth the previous night. My parents' rules loosened up during trips like these, and I think my mom reminded me too much of things that, when she's not paying attention, I completely forget to do them. The clock said it was only 5 in the morning, yet there was light outside. I really wasn't used to seeing the horizon. Too many shadows of houses all the time where I lived. When I figured out how to unlock the door, I felt the nice, cool air rush inside. Fortunately, I didn't make so much noise. I wanted to walk around the field a little bit. One of my aunts was already awake and outside. She waved at me from her chair. She was sewing something, and she had some clothing on her lap and a needle gripped by her teeth when she smiled at me. I walked down the field along the fence that separated the property from the street. The area seemed to go on forever, and all I had for reference was a little wall of bricks laid out in a circle far in front of me, and the house behind me. I kept imagining my uncles as little kids, running around with dirty school shoes before getting yelled at by their moms. Maybe tied up horses being walked by their caretaker along the dirt road. When I got to the pile of bricks, I realized that it was actually a short well. It went up to my hip. So different than what wells look like in the movies. There was a rope and a bucket on top of the rusty sheet of metal that covered it. I faced the rising sun as I slid the sheet to the right and looked into the well. There was no way I'd be able to see how deep it was, but I still tried. I leaned over it as I waited for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. When the sun was blocked as a shadow covered me and part of the well, the shadow of someone standing right in front of me. I looked up, cautiously expecting to see someone else there. Yet all I heard were cries. Cries coming from the darkness. The metal sheet crashed to the ground as I ran as fast as I could, yelling for my aunt. Both her and my mom were outside now, looking toward me, drying up their hands with their shirts, waiting for me to say something. Then my mom knelt down and grabbed me by the shoulders, looking at me and then over me to see what I had been running away from. But when I told her about the well, the cries, the shadow, she let go of me. She stood up and asked me when it happened, but now I could tell she was disinterested. I saw my aunt walking closer to me. She had heard me explain the shadow I had seen as Mom walked around the corner of the house. Things just stayed like that for most of the trip. It took one of my mom's rude uncles to finally tell me what had happened, after my story circulated with my cousins and everyone. That's when I learned another story about that field where my mom grew up. Mom and one of her brothers were supposed to clean out the well one morning. It supposedly wasn't that deep, and all they had to do was lay down the rope in a loop, as one of them grabbed on and went down with it, and then later filled up the bucket with the trash I had gathered up in there. Then let the bucket come back up until the place was clean, and then they'd just climb out of the well. They had done so many times and considered it kind of like a dare. But the loop that Mom had made had come loose one time, and her brother splashed into the dark water below, unable to grab onto the slippery walls of it. My mom yelled and tried to tie the loop again to let it down, but with every twist her shaky hands tried to make, the screams turned to gurgles, and the gurgles turned to subtle splashes. The splashes turned to silence. Back when I was growing up, my family had a neighbor that was sort of part of the family. He lived with his dog named Kimball, who we played with. Our neighbor would sometimes drive us to our baseball games, and he was a very good guy. His name was Greg. It was Christmas time, and the houses were all decorated. Being like 9 or 10 years old, I remember things like Christmas lights were still cool to me. But I really looked forward to the presents. It was around the time that the Game Boy Advance was coming out, and I was waiting anxiously for it. My dad had ordered it for me at a place called Radio Shack, and even though I no longer believed in Santa Claus, my dad still liked to hide the presents. Everyone knew what they were, but we weren't allowed to open them until the evening of Christmas Eve. That's how we did things at our house. But I searched all over for it. My parents' walk-in closet, at the top part where they knew I couldn't reach, under the bed, their drawers, but nothing. The previous year, Greg let my parents store my bike that was my present for my birthday in his garage. Maybe it was at his house? My window faced Greg's empty room, the one that his children used to live in. I don't remember anyone ever being there, but I could see inside whenever Greg cleaned the room and left the window curtains open. There were 2 beds, one with pink sheets, and the other with the covers of a cartoon I used to like called Animaniacs. Across from the beds was a set of drawers, but that's all I could see. Even when my sister and I had to stay there while we waited for my parents to come back home after school, back when we were younger, Greg told us to not go into any of the rooms. Mom said that he lived alone with his dog because his family moved away. I remember thinking how sad it would be if I ended up that way, even though living with a calm dog like Kimball would be pretty cool too. It was a couple of weeks before Christmas when something woke me up in the middle of the night. The moans and shrieks of someone in pain. The light from the hallway turned on, and Dad cracked open my door. I sat up right away, blinded by the light a little bit. "Did you hear that?" he asked me. "Yeah, from outside," I said. Dad walked over to the window and I stood up from my bed to walk over to it. Greg had his lights on in the downstairs area, sort of by where his kitchen was, and in his bedroom as well. "We better check on him," he said, walking away. I heard him say something to Mom about Greg's number. I heard Dad talk with Greg on the phone for a couple of minutes. Then Dad forced out a nervous chuckle and listened to him until he finally told Greg to try to get some sleep. In the meantime, I saw my ceiling become dimmer as Greg turned off his lights next door and get replaced by the reflection of the red and green Christmas lights that were hanging from his roof. Down the hall, I could hear Mom and Dad talking about Greg's nightmares. Maybe I'm not remembering this correctly, but back when I asked my parents why Greg lived by himself, they told me to never bring it up in front of him. It was strange even back then, to think that adults also had nightmares. What kind of things could you possibly dream about that would cause an adult to scream in the middle of the night? It seemed like every other night, Greg would scream, wake himself up, go to the kitchen. I would stand up to look out my window, waiting for Dad to come back in or to call him. We didn't call him ever since that first night. Mom said that there were medicines that would make you get nightmares. I knew cough medicine did that. Why didn't he just stop taking it? But for a couple of nights, the screams stopped. But then again, everything else did too. The little green and red bulbs wouldn't come on from his house at night. And Dad called the police when Greg didn't come out to answer the door after hearing Kimball barking inside. I didn't know that dog could bark. Greg had died in his sleep, supposedly of natural causes. Some of his relatives we had never seen showed up and set up a funeral for him, and we were invited. It was the first time someone around me had passed away. I learned that dogs also felt sad for their owners. The others that were there were nice to us and treated us like family. Greg only really had us to rely on when he needed something. And my parents cared about Greg very much. It was a few days before Christmas now, and Kimball had settled into our house. He knew how to ask to be taken outside. He'd sit by the window to wait for the mailman, and he would sleep half the day. Yet whenever we took him to the front yard, he'd run over to Greg's house and scratch at the door. One of those times, Kimball managed to get into Greg's yard and into the house and stayed there the whole day. He did that on Christmas Eve as well. I opened the presents to the much-awaited game I wanted and ran upstairs to get batteries. But once in my room, I heard howling. It was Kimball. He yelped and howled. I ran to my window to look outside, but before I could scan the area, I heard a loud crash and glass breaking. I caught a glimpse of Kimball flying through the window and rolling onto the grass of Greg's backyard. I screamed and nearly tumbled down the stairs when I went to tell my dad. Dad and I ran to the backyard to get Kimball. He was bleeding from his head and ears, but surprisingly, It didn't seem too serious. We never found out what had happened. I stayed up late for a few nights playing my new games, with Kimball on his dog bed by my door. Everything was fine for about 2 weeks, when, a few days into the new year, everything started to get strange. It was like a whimper at first, the sounds that Kimball made in his sleep. Then they turned to growls and full-on barking as he moved his legs as if he was running. I managed to wake him up a couple of times, and he would whimper for hours at night. That's when he started getting sick. He wouldn't eat. He'd whimper around the room, refusing to leave it. But his growls at night wouldn't stop. I experienced one of the most frightening dreams of my life soon after that. It started as a low and deep tapping sound from under my bed, almost like wet breathing, crawling out from under it. My head was covered in the blanket, and I couldn't bring myself to peek out at whatever it was. It hovered around to the foot of my bed and around to the other side when I heard another tapping. Now there were two. Two of something crawling out from under my bed. Kimball growled and whimpered off to my right. I tried to summon the courage to see what it was, but my arms were so numb with the fear that all I could do was scream. Kimball barked louder and louder as the tap started again, from the same area. I kicked at the blanket to try to pull it down until I felt the heat from under my blanket escape and a gush of cold air rushing in. I opened my eyes. 3 tall figures standing over me. Kimball barking at them by the door, at these hooded shapes far too dark to see clearly. They screamed so loudly and couldn't move away, I didn't know how to escape. Suddenly, the green and red glowing lights from the window reflected off my walls, and I heard the familiar, "Hey buddy, you're all right." It was Greg. The shadows melted to the floor. I heard Kimball tapping the floor with his wagging tail when everything went quiet. My t-shirt was sticking to me from the cold sweat as I sat up on my bed and sighed with relief. Stillness. I looked over to Kimball. He was sleeping soundly now.